You have to dig deeper than that. We are barely mining the high-quality coal. Anthracite, critical to steel production. It hardly exists in America anymore. Gone over the last 100 years. The low-grade quality coal, the subbituminous coal, we've got tons of that. That's why, over the last 50 years or so, we keep growing coal production by about 2% annually. But the energy we get from those bigger hauls is flatlining. So we're getting less from more.
We have one solution in front of us that can act as a bridge until we make some sort of breakthrough in a renewable option: natural gas. But I'm not quite sure it will help us all feel comfortable about the future. The big problem here is that while natural gas is very cheap, the infrastructure is not in place, and we'd have issues getting mass adoption without a complete government intervention, which isn't going to happen the way Congress and the White House behave with one another these days. But even with those hurdles, I think America is going to lean on natural gas as much as possible going forward. The EROEI ratio for natural gas is pretty healthy right now. It falls around 15-1, so it's much better than oil. And there's a whole lot of natural gas, an estimated 100 years worth in America alone. Plus, we've got 487,000 natural gas wells across 30 states right now. So some big positives there.
Unfortunately, by my estimates, we have 60,000 processes in this country that rely on petroleum. It's everything from growing and transporting food to household items needed to make our lives easier. For example, it costs $35,000 to convert a truck engine to natural gas right now, $18,000 for a regular car. And you know what? Out of 117,000 gas stations in America, only 500 offer natural gas to the public. And even though you have a country like France that offers 62 natural gas cars to choose from, here in America you'll be extremely lucky to find a couple at your local dealership. So even with natural gas as a vital option, we've got a long road ahead before it replaces oil.
The real negative is the time to start this massive overhaul of our energy system was in the 1970s when the U.S. peaked in oil production. Fortunately, we aren't starting from scratch with natural gas, but since we haven't taken the necessary steps to integrate it into our society, I estimate we are at least 20 years behind the curve. And we don't have 20 years. We might not even have 5 before oil becomes too expensive for society.
So what we're left with is a very solid case that the first of the 3 E's, energy, actually guarantees that our pyramid scheme theory comes to fruition. Because if our energy system can't continue to grow exponentially, it definitely won't be able to power exponential growth in our environment, and certainly not in our economy. So I think we should talk about that next.
If our ability to harness cheap energy is limited, this will send shockwaves throughout our society. So a little later, the team will discuss what this energy crisis means for our country, national security, and your prosperity. But first, to further examine the pyramid scheme, we need to discuss the 2 other E's. Now, I want to reiterate something I mentioned at the beginning of this broadcast. The next chapter in the story has yet to be written. You can take steps to protect your wealth and your way of life. So let's move on to the environment, the second E. You're about to discover why we may be struck by American food shortages in the coming years. You'll hear a startling 200-year-old prediction from an English pastor that may now be coming true. And you'll see why, by 2015, the world could experience armed conflict over water, not oil. Energy was just the first domino to fall. The next 2 will really drive home the fact that our future is one big pyramid scheme.
I always find it interesting to listen to people talk about the relationship between energy and the environment, mostly because I think the wrong story is being told. It's usually being driven by an environmentalist agenda. I'll let folks come to their own conclusions there. What I'm most concerned with is that just like with energy, we also rely on exponential growth patterns with many different aspects of our environment. Realistically, we couldn't maintain these patterns even if we had unlimited energy. But since we don't, it really is the final nail in that coffin. Now, it would be nearly impossible to investigate all of these exponential growth factors in the environment. So I feel we're really best suited to just focus on the 2 areas that people think about the most. food and water. By just linking those two areas to our pyramid scheme theory and showing how they are interconnected with our energy and economic systems, I think we'll be able to present a fairly open and shut case.
Well, guys, you know, there's no question we've come to the right place to do just that. Look around, gentlemen. This is something that's going to go extinct in this country, your average American farm. For a long time now, we've been seeing less and less of these kinds of farms in the American landscape, and I predict it's going to get a lot worse as energy prices surge. You can't grow food without oil. You can't fertilize it. You can't harvest it. You can't transport it. So what happens when energy becomes too expensive? Frankly, guys, I think you're going to see a mass exodus of small farmers in this country. Back in Thomas Jefferson's day, 9 out of 10 Americans made their living in the fields. When Abe Lincoln was elected president, that number had dropped to half. By the time FDR was sworn in, only 2 in 10 Americans made their living as full-time farmers. Now, that number is only 1 in 500. With fewer farmers, nearly 313 million mouths to feed in this country, where's the food going to come from? I think it's going to come from one place: factory farms. Agribusiness is booming in America, there's no doubt about that. But the basic economics in our food system in our country are pricing it right out of the average farmer's budget. I think all of this plays a big role in that second E in our pyramid scheme theory, the environment.
Here's what we know. The prices of food staples like wheat, beef, corn, sugar, and just about every food item are up big since the millennium. But so is oil. That's not a coincidence. Farmland prices have also been going through the roof lately. And that's because there is so much less of it now. Over the last 25 years alone, America has converted over 41 million acres of land into condos, strip malls, and other developments. That's the equivalent of removing Illinois and New Jersey from the map. Add it up. You've got higher food prices, higher fuel costs, more people, and less land to use for growing food. So farming now is more than ever a volume enterprise, and factory farms are the big winner there.
You know, this is really interesting, guys, when you consider that last year farm revenues were actually the highest on record. Yet Time magazine actually found that 82% of the income average farmers bring in is now coming from non-farm sources. So what that means is that most average farmers have just become part-timers. Think about it. They've been driven out by the factory farms.
Now here's a scary thought. What if our future offers no other choice but factory farms? Big conglomerate entities instead of the kinds of farms we've known all our lives. I think we are left with no other choice here because of some very obvious exponential growth trends we're running headfirst into. The United Nations future population estimates form a near perfect exponential growth curve. And it shows you that we are well on our way to a tipping point here. More people put a larger drain on our energy needs. They require more food, more money, more everything. If you narrow the focus to just America over the last 100 years, you'll see that our food consumption patterns are growing even faster, meaning we are eating more food per person while our population explodes and our farmland disappears. So factory farms are going to be a necessary evil just to keep the food coming. But it's still unsustainable. The average person in this country is responsible for 32 metric tons worth of food, water, minerals, and energy from the environment every single year. China and India are modernizing at a rapid rate, so their populations will put more of a strain on our ability to divvy up the resources, at least in a cost-effective manner. The UN believes we have to double our food production by 2050 to meet the demands of growing world populations. Where's that food going to come from? Only about 1/10 of the land on this planet is suitable for farming. About 40% you could put cattle and animals on, so that's about half the land we can't do anything with. And we may have to embrace factory farms if we want to get by. But even those giant agricultural entities are going to fall victim to our pyramid scheme theory in the future.
You know, I agree. Those factory farms require a lot of energy to operate. Right now, the cycle of bringing food from the farm to the markets takes up 2/3 of the United States domestic oil production, guys. The average American's food intake for the year requires 400 gallons of oil to bring it to the kitchen table. Not many people know that it takes a pound of diesel to make a pound of fertilizer. So if you've got a big family, you're just using a lot of oil to eat. We're going to need unprecedented innovation in how and where we grow food to keep up with the rising numbers of our population. We're going to need big technological leaps in plowing, fertilizer, forest management, you name it. But where are they? And will they appear in time to prevent a severe crisis?
You know, we saw phosphate fertilizer prices rise 350% from 2003 to 2008. And in 2008, food riots broke out in 40 countries. I don't think that's a coincidence. And I think American food shortages are not a matter of if, but a matter of when. To think we couldn't experience that kind of crisis would be foolish, especially when food prices will soar in the future. Plus, America currently imports 100% of its needs for 18 minerals and elements. We are already beginning to accuse China of hoarding minerals. This will only get worse as our demands increase and these resources become ever more scarce, which means we'll all feel the strain in our bank accounts. People without the necessary financial stability to afford these increases will have some tough decisions to make. Back in the late 1700s, a Reverend Thomas Malthus was one of the first to predict that the world's explosive population growth would eventually overrun our ability to feed ourselves. He was a highly controversial figure, but his theories have become a mainstay with many biologists and some economists. Malthus even went so far as to write that the power of population is so superior to the power of the earth to produce sustenance for man that premature death must, in some shape or other form, visit the human race. Pretty extreme words, and they didn't come true in his day or in the days that followed. But back in Malthus's time, there were only 1 billion people on the planet. It took another 123 years to hit that 2nd billion, just 33 more years to hit 3 billion, 14 years to hit 4 billion, just 13 more years after that to hit 5 billion, and then 12 years to hit 6 billion. And now we're at 7 billion and counting. It's a near perfect trend of exponential growth. And Malthus didn't have to deal with similar and equally dangerous exponential growth patterns in energy like we do now. So maybe his worries about peak food were early, but eventually they may turn out to be frighteningly accurate.
I think water will be a very topical issue in this country within the next decade. Look at where we're at now. The Potomac River runs through D.C., Maryland, Virginia. There are 7 cities right along this 7-mile stretch here. Most people don't think about it, but energy plays a critical role in our ability to use water. And we all know we need a lot of it to grow food. Unfortunately, water is also experiencing startling exponential growth patterns for agricultural use. The same pattern is appearing for our domestic water use and also for our industrial purposes. Water plays an enormous role in our pyramid scheme theory.
It sure does. I was part of a think tank meeting in Zurich a couple years ago that investigated the future of water. This is a much bigger issue than people realize. We concluded that the likelihood of armed conflicts arising over water will be extremely high by 2015. I'm talking about higher than oil or even democracy. That means it's an almost near certainty. What makes this notion especially hard to grasp for some is that we aren't running out of water. There's actually plenty of it, lakes, ponds, and oceans all around us. But we have the same amount of water on this planet now as we've had for our entire history. About 360 quintillion gallons. Guys, that's 360 with 18 zeros behind it. The problem is 97% of all water is salt water, so you can't drink it or use it to grow food. And converting it to fresh water is especially problematic because it's energy intensive and it's time consuming. That's another predicament all in and of itself, just because in the last 10 years alone, freshwater demand across this planet has spiked by 58%. Personally, I find that very startling. So right there, water becomes a big factor in all 3 E's.